Support for this podcast comes from Smart Recruiters. Are you looking to supercharge your hiring? Meet Winston, Smart Recruiters' AI-powered companion. I've had a demo of Winston. The capabilities are extremely powerful, and it's been crafted to elevate hiring to a whole new level. This AI sidekick goes beyond the usual assistant, handling all the time-consuming admin work so you can focus on connecting with top talent and making better hiring decisions. From screening candidates to scheduling interviews, Winston manages it all with AI precision, keeping the hiring process fast, smart, and effective. Head over to smartrecruiters.com and see how Winston can deliver superhuman results.
There's been more of scientific discovery, more of technical advancement and material progress in your lifetime and mine than in all the ages of history.
Hi there, welcome to episode 661 of Recruiting Future with me, Matt Alder. The adoption of AI in talent acquisition continues to accelerate, promising efficiencies and new possibilities for hiring. However, as AI tools become more central to recruiting processes, they bring significant challenges, particularly around bias, compliance, and trust. Without clear oversight, these systems risk entrenching inequalities rather than addressing them. So, how can talent acquisition leaders ensure that AI supports fairer hiring while safeguarding compliance and trust? And what role does auditing play in this critical process? My guest this week is Jeff Pohl, co-founder and CEO at Warden AI, a company specializing in AI auditing for HR and TA technologies. In our conversation, Jeff shares his insights on the importance of auditing AI systems, the emerging regulatory landscape, and how talent acquisition leaders can better understand and navigate the risks and opportunities of AI-powered hiring. Hi, Jeff, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Matt. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
An absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Please, could you introduce yourself and tell everyone what you do?
So I am Jeff Pohl. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a startup called Warden AI. And we work within HR and talent technology to help overcome some of the adoption barriers facing the deployment of AI solutions, particularly focusing on AI bias and fairness. Before that, my background is in the last decade in AI. I was machine learning and engineering by trade originally, and I've worked in a number of different AI companies, particularly focusing on regulation technology, which is what's brought me to this new space of AI trust and AI compliance.
Fantastic. So we'll dive into trust, compliance, and risk and regulation and all those kind of things around AI as we get into the conversation. Before we do, though, I'm just really interested, as someone, you've been working with AI for a kind of really long time, sort of all of your career, as far as I can see. Have you been surprised by how quickly things have shifted and moved forward in the last sort of 18 months, 2 years or so?
It's a really interesting one, actually. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. So yeah, as I mentioned, been working in the industry for over a decade, always in AI driven products in one way or another. And I've always been optimistic about AI and always been excited about the future and a big believer in the possibilities. But I must say, as a professional working in the industry the last decade, it's mostly been a bit disappointing, right? Like the level, a lot of people talk about AI, but the level of AI being used has been quite minimal. And there's a joke in the industry that you might have come across that if an AI product actually works, then it's actually humans behind it. It's maybe masqueraded as an AI or automation, but really maybe there's a team in, offshore, maybe in India, lots of people like working on some manual process quickly to make it look like it's an AI system. And I've definitely worked at the companies that have done that in the last decade. Almost to the point that I was like, in the last few years, getting a bit disillusioned and thinking, is this really going to ever happen? And so the advent of large language models getting to the quality that they did, 2 or 3 years ago, with ChatGPT, most notably, has been like a bit of a reawakening of no, this is for real. This is AI has huge potential, is actually going to make big strides. So I kind of surprised in that sense, but obviously, big picture, being a big believer in the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of sort of proof that it is a real thing in business, and it, just has this kind of huge potential. And do you think that the current pace of change, which is quite phenomenal, is that set to continue in terms of the sort of innovation around AI and the development of it?
I would say yes. I mean, in the macro sense, definitely yes. If you look back at technology diffusion or technology adoption over time, whether looking back at the adoption of the telephone or cell phones more recently, and then now large language models, every sort of generation, the time it takes for the technology to be adopted, whether that's measured as like the time it takes for the average American home to have it, or to get to 100 million users, is much faster than before, right? Telephones was like 70 years, cell phones 14 years, and ChatGPT got to 100 million users in 2 months, which is the fastest ever growing technology. So in that sense, that's always going to get faster. So with the next breakthrough in 5-10 years, we'll be even faster than that. I'm confident on. In a more micro sense, like there's divided opinion on this. I think some believe that the actual level of intelligence, if you will, that these particularly large language models are developing is slowing down a little bit compared to the last few years. So we might see that the actual sheer kind of incremental improvements will be not quite as ground shattering kind of leaping as the last few years. But what I think we will see is that the cost will continue reducing, because the more that something is built, the more people get savvy about reducing the cost of building it, so that these models will get cheaper to build. And as costs go down, adoption increases. And really, it's adoption that it's been impressive to see how many people have jumped on this and tried to get involved. But actually, I think that's in its infancy. And I think the adoption, which is really what innovation is, right? Like actually being used in ways that's helpful to the world, we will see increasing and accelerating over the next few years, next decade.
No, absolutely. And I suppose that sort of brings us on to the first question about this, really. So for all the talent acquisition leaders who are out there, some people are very enthusiastic in their adoption of this. Some people are a bit more cautious. Everyone is kind of having to adopt it by default, because large language models, new ways of working with AI are kind of being built into pretty much every product that people use in the sector. What are the sort of the risks of all of this? What do people kind of need to be aware of when it comes to this sort of AI revolution?
I guess huge opportunities, right? And I think with any big opportunity and reward, there's always great risk as well. So it's kind of not a surprise that there's a lot of risks involved too. So there's many to cover. One is, I would say, the data side of things, right? Data privacy violations, protecting copyright, protecting an employers or organizations' data as they might interact with and deploy different AI solutions. I mean, data concerns have been around for a while, so we're quite, as a society, quite mature, I would say, in being aware of them and conscious of them. And there's lots of mature regulations and frameworks around that are just sort of being adapted to address data risks within AI products as well. So that's a big one. It's probably the biggest one on the like, in terms of like a buy, someone buying an AI product. It's probably the biggest concern they have is what about the data. But what's more interesting, at least to me, is that there are new risks that maybe didn't really exist in traditional software before, that are now apparent with AI, with artificial intelligence technology, which really relates to the fact that AI is often about making decisions or influencing decisions and taking them away from humans. So if AI is being used, for example, to screen resumes and speed up that process in a way that it's hard for humans to go around and look at every 10,000 resume and application that have come in today, then that leads to new risks about why it recommends or scores certain candidates a certain way, where of course bias and fairness in the context of recruitment is huge. So that's a big one. And just more generally, like how, like, even if it's not bias per se, can we even understand like why it's made that decision? Can it explain itself? Which leads to a lot of knock-on risks, I would say. There's liability potential, for example, if an organization can't justify why an AI reached a certain conclusion about a person who applied, then there's a discrimination potential sort of liability claim that could be made on the back of that. And then there's of course emerging AI regulations, the EU AI Act, and New York City has local law 144 in Colorado, and we'll get onto more of that, I'm sure. There's then compliance requirements, and just the sheer risk of not being compliant itself is also a risk that's coming. And maybe the last one is most important, perhaps, is on the candidate experience. Is that how does, aside from any direct sort of legal or like monetary repercussion, how does all of this increasing levels of AI affect candidates and their experience, their perception of the organization and the reputation it has? So I think that was also quite an important one to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to, I suppose, also to say at this point, there are huge benefits of using AI, but it's kind of is really important that people kind of understand what's going on. And I suppose just to dig down into some of that in a bit more detail, let's start with regulations. What's the sort of current state of play across Europe, the UK, the US with regulations around AI?
I often like to start talking about AI regulation by talking about regulations that are not about AI that are still relevant. So let's not forget that any, for example, in the context of bias and discrimination, any regulation that already exists to do with anti-discrimination, whether that's the Civil Rights Act in the US or Equality Act in the UK and elsewhere, those still apply equally to an AI-powered system or a human-powered system. It doesn't matter. It's illegal to discriminate in any way. And if found to do so, then that's against the law and has ramifications. So in the sense, we have a lot of the regulation we already need because we've regulated humans for a long time, and AI is sort of in many ways just replicating or supporting those processes. But obviously there are a growing number of AI specific regulations, which is important too. The key ones are in Europe. The EU AI Act has passed a comprehensive set of regulation around AI, which is been signed and has a slightly staggered rollout in terms of different scenarios taking effect. But by and large, for most people, certainly in this context of recruitment, the effects will come in about 2 years, August in 2026, if not mistaken, where any system categorized as high risk, which really includes any AI used in a kind of employment opportunity context, has to undergo fairly stringent requirements to be even allowed onto the market in the first place. So that's one that's pretty stringent, and we can go into more detail on it. And then the UK hasn't regulated anything yet. It has kind of principles. There's talk that the new government might do a regulation soon. And then in the US, what we're seeing is largely a lack of a strong stance from a federal level, which probably will stay that way for a while. But state-specific regulation. So states are kind of encouraged to take their own stance on this, and we're seeing a growing number of states, passing their own either guidance or indeed regulation. So we have, for example, Colorado quite recently released the so-called AI Consumer Protection Bill, SB 205, which targets recruitment and employment as one of a number of high-risk use cases of AI with a number of fairly stringent requirements. That's an interesting one to maybe talk more about. New York City is the only local, just the city itself has a local regulation which requires bias audits to be done on any AI used in some form of decision making around candidates and applications, and that's already been live for I think almost 2 years now. And then there's a number of other states looking at similar. So New York State itself, New Jersey State are looking at a bill that have been in place that are not dissimilar from the New York one. And so, there's obviously other states too, but that's a kind of key summary of the ones that are targeting employment and recruitment the most. California, quite a lot on AI. It's a little bit, not many of the bills are directly related to employment and recruitment, but have a number of regulations about data privacy and others like that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well. And there's obviously this is not just about regulation, but it's also about ethics and fairness, which I think we'll probably get into in a minute. But before we do that, just one really specific question. When a lot of vendors who are putting AI into their system or AI startups, when I talk to them and I talk to them about regulation, there's always this comment that gets made about, obviously, our AI doesn't make any decisions when it comes to hiring. However, as you said earlier in the conversation, it does influence that decision in terms of the matching and all that kind of stuff. How does that kind of sit with everything? Because, it's not making a final decision, but it is very much influencing the direction that final decision goes in.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And certainly, as you mentioned, everyone's very keen to say, of course, humans are very involved, partly because the risks are so big, partly because we don't want to scare people and say, you don't need humans anymore, like AI will do all of this. And obviously AI is not good enough yet to do everything like that. But I think the key thing, and where most of the regulations are going with this, is if it's influencing, it's materially impacting the ultimate human decision, which is still taken at the end, then it's considered high risk, right? And I think the word decision is maybe not used in many of the regulations, although the New York City one is an example of that. But I think the other ones are a bit more nuanced, and it's more like if it's involved in this kind of use case, e.g. employment opportunity, then it's high risk. And the standards are still emerging to be more specific, but I don't think they'll necessarily be quibbling too much about exactly what counts, and more be kind of inclusive of anything that influences or could influence. Will then just be it's potentially high risk, so we're going to treat it as high risk. You therefore have to follow the more stringent regulation. So I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, and it's not that it's outlawed from doing this. It's just that there has to be a level of transparency there, which I suppose is the perfect opportunity to ask you a bit more about Warden AI, what you do and why you do it.
Yeah, so our mission at Warden is to drive the fair and compliant adoption of AI systems. So we're talking a lot about risks, but as we mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity. And so we're kind of really based on the premise that AI is not only kind of fast and cost efficient, but can also be more ethical and more fair, for example, people-led processes. But it's a double-edged sword, right? So it can entrench those issues. It could entrench and worsen the bias that we already see in recruitment, or it can actually overcome it or mitigate it and do less of it. And so our role in this is to kind of shine a light on AI systems used in recruitment and HR more generally, and help kind of the more ethical ones flourish the most, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you kind of audit some of the tools that are out there, don't you?
Exactly. So a bit more concretely, we come in as a third party and do what we call AI assurance or AI auditing. And so our product becomes embedded into an AI system. Let's imagine this is a resume screening system, for example. It's quite a common use case we work with. And our product will do kind of continuous testing and monitoring of how that AI actually behaves for some of these risks and trust issues, and particularly focusing on bias at the moment. So we'll test how biased it is, help to mitigate those issues, be compliant with these emerging regulations, and then ultimately, assuming everything is well and we help get there, then ultimately giving confidence to the stakeholders or customers of the system, that they can trust it and actually deploy it with confidence.
When it comes to bias, what sort of particular types of bias are you potentially seeing in AI systems, or you're checking in AI systems? Where are the kind of biggest risks? What's the sort of biggest focus there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm always trying to be careful of saying which forms of, which categories are more important or less than others, right? And of course, for the technical people, their bias is inevitable in a system, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing. What we're really talking about is unwanted or harmful bias. So bias that's against, for example, certain sexes, certain genders, races, age, and others. In terms of our offering, we focus originally on sex and around race and ethnicity. And we actually just this week have announced age bias assurance that we've added to our system. So we now look at examining whether or how these AI systems treat different age groups. And we're also got prototypes and launching soon, disability and veteran status and religion, sexual orientation, and otherwise working our way through the list of protected characteristics that kind of vary slightly from regulation to regulation, but are cover a lot of those types of issues.
And I suppose this might be a question that is too difficult to answer, or you might not want to answer it. But there's obviously been lots of anecdotal stories about biased AI. So, there's a few that kind of float around when it comes to AI making decisions about recruitment. So, some of them have actually never been confirmed as actually having happened. Are you actually finding, much bias in here? What level of kind of risk is there? What's the sort of the true picture when it comes to these AI systems? Are they full of bias and rigged to come out with certain, rigged is the wrong word, but come out with certain results? What's the actual, state of play with it?
Yeah, so obviously it varies a lot, right? And there are some confirmed cases. So the EEOC's, I think, first ever AI bias lawsuit was around age discrimination. A company that was, I think, found to be fairly systematically discriminating against age using an automated tool. So definitely real issue. Yeah, there's examples that abound of it being real, and you'll there's certainly many papers come out probably one a month, if not more, come out with a new study of how ChatGPT or similar language model has been demonstrated to be biased, but better measurement. So it's definitely a real issue, and obviously there's quite a lot of news about it, and rightly so. That said, depending on the system itself, we're actually seeing that a lot of times it's good and arguably more fair than humans, even though it's a little bit of a tricky one to measure. Something we're working on the background is like quite, basically benchmarking what the status quo is, right? What is in this industry, what is a standard level of bias, sex or whatever attribute we're looking at, and then how does the AI compare to that? So even if it's not perfect, if it's at least significantly better the average human process, which we know is far from great, then that's an improvement, even if there's still something there. So it varies, but overall, I would say the news stories are probably make it sound like it's more of something to be deeply worried about. It's something you should be concerned about, but there are, you can be overcome, and there are various techniques and tools out there that help with this issue. So I don't think it should fundamentally be a reason not to go ahead, but it should definitely be something that's on the mind of anyone who's looking at an AI, particularly in this context, and obviously a key provision to our mission and why we exist.
I mean, I guess you make a really interesting point there, because we're kind of judging AI, looking for transparency, all of this kind of stuff in a way that we don't do with human decision making at that kind of granular level. So I think that is a kind of a really important point in terms of, is this a kind of a much fairer and better way, even if it's not perfect.
Exactly. That's it. We do hold machines up to higher standards than we do humans in many cases, which I think is for a good reason in many ways. Like the danger of this going wrong is we not only just have, a mixture of levels of unconscious or conscious bias in people, but we then potentially codify at scale a system to entrench that, right? Which is pretty scary when you think of the scale involved, and it being like almost like unintentionally or intentionally codified into the training data or whatever the AI is being built on. So that risk is great, but I think probably the reality that we're at the moment is, in many cases, the fear and the standard we're aiming for the AI, for the machines, is actually higher than we do for humans. And maybe it's okay if it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than the humans are. So anyway, so we in terms of our approach, we don't necessarily make like hard judgments on this, but we have the data and tools to assess it as a third party and then present the findings. So these are the third parties' findings, or it's ongoing, right? So here's the ongoing reports and findings we've had that can be shared around with whomever our customer wants to share it with, to then give transparency to other people. But in this case of not just take our word for it, we're not marking our own homework, we've been marked with someone else, here's what you can see, rather than us necessarily saying this is definitely absolutely no bias whatsoever kind of thing. No one can make that statement.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you've mentioned sort of a few things around this already, but maybe as a bit of a summary for us, what are the things that heads of talent acquisition should be considering when they're either assessing a new AI in a current solution, or looking at buying or even creating, an alternative solution?
Good question. I think, well, the main thing is going to be first and foremost on how accurate the system is, or how valuable it is. Is it actually helping? Is it useful? Because a lot of these people are jumping in on the AI bandwagon, as it were, and it's not necessarily actually helping or valuable or accurate in the way it works. So I would still put that as number one, and obviously only you and your business and your needs can judge that truly as to whether that is helpful. But then some of the wider concerns would be those are the things we talked about. Like, is it fair? Or at least asking the solution provider, how they measure or mitigate or monitor for bias in particular. And then I think what will be increasingly important is to ask about compliance with AI regulations. So as I've mentioned, almost all of them are still prospective; they're emerging rather than being here now. But time flies, and so if you're picking a provider now, you want them to be one that's hopefully going to be compliant and is taking that seriously for when those regulations do kick in the next year or two.
As a final question, obviously we've talked about risks and things like that, but let's talk about potential. So what does the future look like? How do you think AI might change talent acquisition in the long term?
Super interesting. I love future gazing at this. Don't know how good my predictions will be, but I think the challenges in talent acquisition, at least as someone who's working in the industry directly, but I see is around really scale and volume, right? So whether that's like how to, as a recruiter going outbound, how to outreach to enough people, how to evaluate all those inbound applicants if you have a high volume of them, or even on candidates, like they want to apply to as many jobs as they can as well, and are now using AI to do that. So it's just everywhere you look, it's like a scale kind of game. And I wonder if we'll move to a world where AI is used more. For example, maybe AI system does do like an initial interview because it can do it scalably, right? Yeah, arguably the reason we have things like resumes and so on is because we don't have time to actually interview everybody. So let's look at something quick. But AI does have time to do that. And so I wonder if what will happen is that we'll have kind of more meaningful touch points for maybe all candidates or more candidates, but with an AI to begin with, before, of course, you get to the human stage later. That's not going anywhere, which will actually maybe reduce the idea that candidates are kind of spam applying to everyone at scale. It's like there's only so many interviews, it's done by an AI, that the candidate can actually, complete. And therefore, that'll actually almost solve the scale problem a little bit. It's like they can actually target the 10 companies, whatever they actually want to apply to, have a first stage interview with an AI, albeit, which might sound crazy right now, and then have a meaningful assessment about their actual fit rather than just a bit of paper that summarizes their experience. And I wonder if that, or something along those lines, will be where it goes. And again, maybe this is still 5-10 years away or more, but I wonder if that's what the future looks like.
I think that's interesting. I think it's like if you have that human kind of touch, that intervention in the process, then maybe it does put the brakes on those kind of things and really help with the quality aspect of everything. Jeff, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks, Matt. It's been a pleasure.
My thanks to Jeff. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can search all the past episodes at recruitingfuture.com. On that site, you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Recruiting Future Feast, and get the inside track on everything that's coming up on the show. Thanks very much for listening. I'll be back next time, and I hope you'll join me.
This is my show.